call his up for you.
Okay, and he's already learned one of his jobs is to remind us when it's, to turn it on and to remind us when to turn it off. Because you just don't realize that it's on. Okay, this is Senate Finance. This is, what are we today? Fifth, sixth,
Fifth.
seventh,
Fifth.
fifth.
I just did my expenses.
I am not getting any internet on my iPad. So I found that out when I tried to do my expenses. We have today, we've got a couple things. I have this list of reports that we get and any that we think we don't want to get anymore. I will pass it around to anyone that wants to look at it. I've just gotten through the first 2 pages, and we have a whole lot of reports on utilization of services and expenses under Choices for Care, Medicaid enrollment and expenditures report, Vermont Health Connect monthly reports. None of those really have anything to do with us. They either go to a Probst or Health and Welfare. They're all on here. But I'll pass it around and, just let me know any reports that you think. I don't ever remember seeing a monthly report from Health Connect, but they're here somewhere, I guess. Okay, so I don't need my agenda. Today we're going to start actually working. We had a day off yesterday with the governor's speech. So Julia is here and we're going to get our first look at the Ed Fund, which I think is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, at least at the beginning of the session. I know my school locally has already asked us back in for a second discussion. And I hope by February we can have some answers, good or bad. So Julia, come on up. And I have one of these, Senator McDonald has one.
There's an extra copy and I gave one to Senator Gould or something.
Okay, there's one there, so there is another one.
Should I just take this one?
Yeah. I will.
It's all online, it's on the committee page.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you can get it all online.
that's why I don't have it on.
That's
I
right.
had said I didn't want it on paper.
I usually want the agenda, but I should have this one. Okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Nice to see you all again at the start of the session. I've been asked to come in today to talk about the Education Fund. So for folks watching online, there are a couple documents posted on the committee page under my name. Madam Chair, would you like me to dive into the Ed Fund Outlook or start with the annotated guide? Did you have a preference of where I begin?
I will ask the committee. This is the first of the session. Let's walk through.
Okay.
Start at the beginning. Once we've had a chance to familiarize ourselves, and then we can start back.
Sounds great. So would you like me to share my screen? Would you like me to share my screen?
Yes, that would be helpful. Then if anybody's watching from home, they can.
Okay.
Let's see, can we blow it up? Make it smaller.
Yeah, smaller.
That even I can read. Okay.
So I'm not going to spend too much time on this document unless there are specific questions you'd like me to work through. I just wanted to make the committee aware that in the off session, we put together an annotated guide to the Education Fund Outlook to help folks remember what different lines mean and how to interpret them. So I found myself often, speaking with people, what does this line mean? How is this line calculated? So this is really supposed to serve as a resource for folks watching at home or you all.
Is that something we have?
Yes, so you do have it in front of you there.
It's also in the committee
Oh, I see,
website.
now I get it, sorry,
We did get sent the annotated maybe a month, 6 weeks ago.
And so it follows the same structure as the Ed Fund Outlook. It should look pretty familiar to this committee as we do look through the Ed Fund Outlook a fair bit. So just to make you aware of that. Any questions on that or moving on to the actual Ed Fund Outlook?
Let's move on.
Okay. Make this a little bit better. Bigger. So, as the committee is aware, there's the December 1st letter, which is statutorily mandated and requires specific modeling assumptions. This is done in consensus, JFO and the tax department in consensus, and is really aimed to serve as a starting point for the deliberations. This does not mean this is what's going to happen, and it's using very, very preliminary data that will continue to be updated over the course of the session. So the outlook that I'm presenting here today reflects those December 1 modeling results.
And we put that out so that schools knew when they developed and presented their budgets, and people voted for the budgets or against them, what the likely outcome would be for their actions.
And so the administration couldn't budget an increase in property values in lieu of the contribution the general fund was supposed to make,
Okay.
which is what happened in the first 3 years of the administration, basically.
Okay, but we don't have a general fund transfer, we have the revenue from the sales tax. So we are not at all dependent on the willingness or the ability of appropriations to transfer money. We are here, yes.
So when, everyone's heard the 18.5% is December 1st figure, and I'm looking at this spreadsheet. Where would that appear, or how does it appear? How does it manifest in here?
Sure, so I can walk through this in detail. Before doing that, I'll point out that you're seeing that 18.5% average bill change compared to the prior year reflected in line H. So it's right there. The uniform refers to the property. There's the 3 classes, right? There's the homestead property tax, there's the non-homestead, and there's the income. So the 18.5% average bill change is uniform across those 3 classes.
So people would pay, with income sensitivity, would pay 18% more on their sensitized bill.
Correct.
Okay.
And this uniform average bill change is laid out in the green books. It's laid out in statute that's how we need to model it. And it is a policy decision moving forward if that is what the General Assembly wants to do or decides to do. So as a bit of a refresher, while we're walking through the Ed Fund Outlook, we have lines A through J here at the top, and these are really summary lines that are reflecting what's happening in the Ed Fund and modeling, as well as some of the assumptions that are going into play here. So we see the in lines C, D, and E, these are the numbers that are often set in the yield bill. So line C, we see the uniform non-homestead property tax rate. I'll remind you that this is the equalized rate. So this is before the application of the common level of appraisal. We see the property yield and the income yield per pupil. When looking at these numbers, it's important to keep in mind that in FY25, Act 127, the pupil weighting bill is coming into play. Act 127 eliminated the equalization ratio. And so because of the elimination of the equalization ratio, the income yield and the property yield are not an apples to apples comparison to the prior year, because up until FY '25, there's been the equalization ratio, which leads to the calculation of the yields being higher than what we're seeing in FY '25 with the elimination of the equalization ratio.
Okay. Refresher, what did the equalization ratio do?
Sure, the equalization ratio was a mathematical exercise. It did not have any impact on the calculation of homestead property tax rates. Essentially, the way that it worked was that, okay, we've got, this is slightly simplified, but all of these pupils, we're applying the pupil weights. So by applying the pupil weights, now we have a weighted pupil count that's greater than the actual average number of kids who are sitting in chairs. And so essentially what the equalization ratio did was say, we're gonna bring that weighted pupil count back down to the number of kids, essentially, that are attending schools. So that was uniformly bringing that number down. And because it was a uniform ratio that was being applied to all school districts, it didn't have any impact on those school districts' tax rates.
Okay,
And because it was solely a uniform ratio that didn't have any impact, in Act 127 during the deliberations, the General Assembly was saying, this is another step to the ed finance calculation that throws some people for a loop. So because it's not impacting anything, let's get rid of it to take away one of the steps in the process.
so there's no impact on the number we're seeing now.
Correct, except for now it's an apples to oranges comparison for FY '25 when comparing to FY '24, the yields.
Okay,
Which makes the percentage increase different than it would have been if the weighting hadn't kicked in. Or
The
was it not?
percentage increase,
Well, this 18% we hear about.
so the 18.5% is regardless of if the equalization ratio was eliminated or not.
Thank you. Because that, you just straightened me out. I was wondering if that was
okay,
part of the generation. The answer is no. If we
Correct.
hadn't had done a new weighting ratio, it would be 18%.
I would say yes, and the elimination of the equalization ratio does not play into the 18.5% average bill change that we're seeing. The change in the pupil weighting formula, I can't say as to if that has had an impact on
Different
tax
impacts in
bills.
different towns.
Exactly.
do we know how many weighted students we had before the change? Because when we were equalizing them, we had equal number of students. Now, some schools are going to have more students, and I'm wondering, do we know how many, how many students did we create with equalization? And how many are we creating now? Because if we've created a large number, start putting all those little parts of a whole together, if we've created new students and no new taxpayers, that is going to affect the tax rate.
Yes, so with Act 127, there are updated and new pupil weights, which are coming into play. The final, the count of those weighted pupils is long-term weighted ADM. That final count has still not come from the Agency of Education. So I can't speak to that because I don't have those final numbers. And I would also note that, yes, school districts with the new pupil weights are seeing increases in the long-term weighted ADM because there is a change in pupil weights. That doesn't necessarily correspond with an increase in tax capacity because it really depends how they are in their long-term weighted ADM when compared to how other districts have been impacted by the weighting change.
Okay.
Keep going.
Keep going. You haven't found that silver bullet yet.
All right, so that's what we're seeing here, just bringing us back, we just were looking at lines C, D, and E. Go up to lines A and B here. This is the average homestead property tax rate and average tax rate on household income, given the yields that we just spoke about. I'll remind you that these are equalized, so before the application of the CLA. And also note that these are the average. So you'll recall that the homestead property tax rate and the income tax rate changed by district based on that per pupil spending. So this does not mean that this is what most homestead or income taxpayers are seeing. It's really a reflection of what we're seeing from these yields across the state. Lines F and G, that gets back to a reflection of the pupils and long-term weighted ADM. So we're tracking the long-term average daily membership and the long-term weighted ADM, which is sort of the new number that we're going to be using moving forward in FY25 with Act 127 pupil weights. So that's why it's a new number in FY25. We spoke about the 18.5.
So if I look at the difference in under FY25, the lines F versus G, that additional roughly 60,000 quote unquote pupils is all due to these, the various factors we applied for rurality, poverty, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly, that's the application. So in line G, you're seeing after all of the pupil weights have been applied.
Yeah.
So that's kids from economically deprived background or disadvantaged backgrounds, ELL learners, small schools, rural, et cetera. Different grades.
Rural was the new category we added.
Yes, rural was new. The calculation of kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds was new, and a lot of the weights were updated.
Yes, and we know they needed to be updated. We knew we needed to do something with ELL. I think it's not all rural children are disadvantaged.
Right.
And that's the category that I'm concerned about.
But I just, it's just interesting to see the magnitude of the adjustments. And, in a certain way it's irrelevant, but I didn't anticipate it changing the number quite so much.
I don't think anyone anticipated an 18% increase in property taxes.
Yes. So this shows 57,000 imaginary pupils that are created with the weights, if I'm not mistaken, the difference between the 141 and the 83,000. Do you know how many pupil weights there were in the old formula? Was it 83,000 real students that went up to 110,000? I don't see that in this summary.
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. And I would also caution with comparing the two numbers because the way that the weights were applied and calculated is different. So the prior pupil weights were in part multiplicative and in part additive. These are solely additive and pick up different categories of students. So I'll certainly get that number to you with the caveat that they can't be directly compared.
Just really quick for clarity, that 83,433, those are actual kids based on those are physical kids.
Yes, it's long-term ADM. So in a 2-year average with state play students. So a few caveats, but in general, on average, how many kids are sitting in a chair in school?
And the other one is how many kids are being paid for to be sitting in a chair in school. Okay. And it would be interesting, I know we did stuff with just additive and multiple, but it would be interesting to see just how many students we have picked up.
So there has been a general decline in student enrollment over time. I put together some charts on that, which I would be happy to share with the committee at some point. But we have seen when adjusting for inflation that education expenditures have remained relatively constant and a declining student population.
Cost per student goes up. Right, we had more students, and the governor threw numbers around yesterday, but I've seen them that the number of school-age children has declined. And we had very small schools to start with. And now we're getting smaller schools, and we're so rural that in many cases, merging is, you can't have a kid in a school bus 6 hours a day to get to school, back and forth. So, yeah, our demographics are causing a fair amount of this. Okay. So,
On the arithmetic, do we know the exact relationship between weighting and the predicted 18% increase in school taxes?
So I would say, there's a number of things that are happening in the education fund and in school district budgets this year. I did also send to Zane, so on your committee page is the tax commissioner's December 1st letter, and in it includes some of these pressures. So that includes things like increases in healthcare costs, inflation, capital construction costs, ending of federal funds. So there's a lot of other factors at play here. So we can't parse out what is only can be attributed to weighting. And I would need to defer to school districts and school boards that are building their budgets with respect to what play Act 127 and the change in pupil weights has had on changes in ed spending decisions.
I know one of our schools in my district has had us in. Part of this weighting was the budget can't go up more than 5% so that there's a walk-in. But between additional labor costs, you gotta give your people a raise, and the 7% inflation, they buy food, I think that was more than 7%. And their healthcare costs, which was either 15 or 16%, which is the statewide bargain teachers' healthcare, that ate up their 5%. So there's no money, and the concern is the yield seems to be going down, and that when we I think it's a 5-year phase in, but when they get to 5 years, there's going to be a whole lot. They're going to be looking at a big tax increase at the local level.
I didn't mean to be singling out weighting, except that was what we were talking about at that moment. Actually, I think I'd like to ask the same question about each of the factors, because I don't understand where that 18% comes from. And my constituents don't, and they want me to explain it to them.
Sure, so that's the 18.5% question. There's, as the chair mentioned, those are many of the factors that we've been hearing that were included in the tax commissioner's letter. Taking a step back to getting back to what Madam Chair was talking about with respect to the pupil weighting transition, I think that this is also sort of plays into your question, where in Act 127, there is the transition provision, which essentially says a school district's equalized homestead property tax rate. So before the application of a CLA, a school district's tax rate cannot increase by more than 5% compared to the prior year. And that goes over the course of 5 years. So getting back to your question, some people have been asking me, well, how can it be that we're capping tax rates at 5%, but we're seeing an average bill change of 18.5%? And really what that gets down to is the fact that an average bill is comprised of 2 parts, right? The rate and the base. So the average tax rate is increasing by 5%.
But what are you taxing?
but the value is increasing by more than 5%. That's where we get to that 18.5%. And that gets back to coming full circle here, back to the Ed Fund outlook. You can see in line J, the education grand list growth estimated that was used for these projections, which was 14.3%. So estimating that in FY25, the grand list would grow by 14.3%. So that's where you can kind of start to wrap your head around, even with the tax rate cap, you can see a larger bill increase on average.
May I make a statement and then a follow-up question? I want you to confirm if my statement sounds correct or off the wall. A lot of what's driving this are what the superintendent submitted in November or prior to November about what they anticipate to be bringing in, rough approximation of what their school budgets will be based on what they're seeing for needs. Nothing that's been approved yet. And that came in at about $180 million more than what last year was. That's factoring into this. As part of the yield.
Yes,
Okay.
So the December 1 modeling, none of this has happened yet, right? School districts are still building their budgets. Most of them haven't been warned yet. Those budgets are going to be voted on in town meeting day. So in December, before December, when we're doing the modeling, AOE needs to provide an estimate of what is AOE's best estimate in terms of ed spending growth and budget growth. So that estimate was what you're seeing here in line I, 12% increase in education spending growth. And just jogging everyone's memory here that ed spending here is not just generally how much are we spending on education, but it's a specific term where we take the budgets, we subtract out offsetting revenues. So that's things like categorical aid, funds coming from the federal government, et cetera, and that remainder is the education spending. So a school district overall could be spending the same amount, but they could see a change in their ed spending year over year if they saw a huge decrease in categorical aid, for instance, or federal funds.
So my question is, if a fair number, more than previously happened or expected, school budgets fail in town meeting day, does that then adjust these estimates? Are we sort of like holding our breath until we see how town meeting day goes?
Yeah, so it's interesting because talking to you all now, I know I normally come in and talk to you in the beginning of the session, and so usually the yield bill starts in Ways and Means, right, and then moves over around crossover or after, and then you all are starting to work on the yield bill when we have a much better sense in terms of what school budgets are looking like. Ways and Means is working on the yield bill before school budgets have been voted. So over the course of the session, as better data comes in, so as we start to see what's happening with school budgets, we're going to be receiving the economic forecast numbers here in a few weeks. We still need the actual long-term weighted ADM numbers that are coming from AOE. We don't know what other policy decisions the General Assembly will decide to make that impact the Ed Fund. So the answer to your question is yes, this will be continued to be revisited, revised. I'll be continuing to model based on what I'm asked to model over the course of the entire session.
Quick follow-up. Yeah. I'm sorry. So I have lived through, as a city councilor in South Burlington, 4 failed budgets that went all the way through to August. And it was probably driven by a variety of factors, but one of them was the amount that was increased. If we have a large number of budgets, and that's what I'm hearing, but who knows, if a large number of budgets continue to fail, and we just don't have those concrete numbers past budgets by the time we adjourn, we just still estimate it based on the best information that we have and where things will likely settle.
Yeah, I think that would be, depending on what happens, unprecedented. And if that were the case, we would need to be doing the best estimates. One of the reasons that the way that the yield bill generally moves is we have a fair bit of certainty by the time that the legislature adjourns what the yields will bring in. We're generally pretty close. And normally there's not a high number of failed budgets.
Line, what would that be? Row J. row J, the projected grand list growth. Can you tell me what goes into the forecast for 2025 that gives it a little bit of a bigger jump, considering the flood? And can we increase the percentage of that forecast by passing a very strong housing bill?
Yes.
So,
You're familiar with the word contentious.
So with respect to the education grand list growth that's coming in the days leading up to December 1st, given where the tax department is at in their equalization study, and so what they're seeing. So that too is an estimate.
Yeah.
And reflects, what are the current estimates for CLAs? What are they seeing in terms of sale prices, et cetera? And with respect to the housing bill, I can't speak to that.
Well, but last year's bill could be helping 20.
Yes, if it does. I mean, we had a huge increase in the grand list just in value.
Yeah.
With the spike in the housing market. However, the housing market, more than the stock market, what goes up comes down, and there's a pretty clear graphing of that. So that will start to equalize out. But I guess my base question is this a perfect storm? I mean, the federal money went away, inflation hit, we've got schools that need repairs. Did that all hit in one year, big spike in the value of houses? Or because if it's a 1-year hit, we might be able to find a way to smooth it out a little bit, maybe find some revenue that could be added in. But is this an ongoing issue? I mean, do we just have to get through it this 1 year and we'll absorb the weighting? Or, inflation is slated, it's down from where it was a year ago. And it's slated, there's gonna be interest rate cuts. It's slated to continue to go down. I think, is it just 1 year we've got to muddle through, or are there forces at play here that are going to continue to be at play for the next X number of years?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball.
I wish it did.
Unfortunately, I don't. So a couple thoughts on that. One, I think that may be a good question to pose to school boards or folks who are on the ground building their budgets, and what do they see
They're coming in next week.
moving forward, in terms of a lot of federal funds are ending moving forward, following the end of the pandemic relief, the ESSER funds. You spoke to healthcare earlier. There's a school, depending on what happens with school construction and capital needs. So I think that's the question.
But bottom line, and our number of kids has been declining for, it must be 20 years now. We have the highest cost per pupil, I think, in the country. And that adds to the cost of living. That's your property tax. So that if the Homes Act does work, but if we get some more people in and more children in those schools, that would help. The cost of heating's, not gonna use more heat if you've got 10 more kids in the school. But it will spread the cost of educating those kids out over 10 more taxpayers. So, okay, so we're all intertwined.
So what, I know that, spikes are hard to deal with. I just wanted to check on two things. One, for grand list, don't we use a 3-year trailing average to do smoothing?
We do, yes, we have, both spikes up and spikes down.
Okay, And then I know that we're, on the federal fund side, not all the ARPA dollars, I don't know how many are flow into the education side of things, but there are still millions of ARPA dollars around to be expended. There's infrastructure jobs act, federal funds to be expended there. And those are going, and there's IRA money to be expended. And I think some of them, flow out to 26, some of them flow out to 2030. I'm just wondering if we're really going off the federal funding cliff that sometimes I'm hearing about.
I don't, other than HVAC kinds of, things, construction, that the ARPA funds went through the general fund budgeting and appropriations process, and they're monitoring that very closely. But what the schools are losing are the ESSER funds, and they went directly to the school, I forget how many millions. And I know there was frustration because we have been very careful not to start new programs and use ARPA funds, or to supplement state funds. So that when they went away, we don't have the shock. We don't know what the schools did with their ESSER money. So some of them may have used it to bring down their budget and their tax rate, and now it's gone and you're seeing a spike. Some of them may have used it to improve things that they needed to improve.
Like HVAC stuff.
HVAC, yeah, it was supposed to be
Remote.
yes. I mean, I think all kids, if there was money available, the school supplied MacBooks so that they could work remotely. Those were but we don't know where that ESSER money went.
Thanks.
So it's not ARPA, it's ESSER that's going.
All right. So moving forward, beyond the summary lines, now we've got the revenue sources flowing into the education fund. So that's in lines 1A through 8. So you're seeing lines 3 through 8, those are the non-property tax revenue sources. So you'll recall that the structure of the ed fund, got all of the ed fund expenditures, and then we subtract out the non-property tax revenue sources, and the remainder is what needs to be made up with property taxes if nothing else changes. So
You said 1 through 8, but you meant 3 through 8, right?
Yes, sorry, 3 through 8 is the non-property tax revenue sources. Exactly. So lines 1A and 1B, this is referring to the homestead property tax. So you'll recall that the property tax credit is on a 1-year lag. So this 158.3 million reflects the income yield that was set in FY24. The 789.3 million you're seeing in line 1A, this is the estimate of how much this homestead property yield is going to bring into the education fund. And we see the estimate for the non-homestead education property tax in line 2.
The non-homestead is bringing in more than homestead. Because I know there's been talk at getting more granular in there and perhaps adjusting some tax rates.
Can I go back to a basic question that I need to answer in my mind? Property values have gone up, like a huge amount. Is that, could one say that's a driving factor in why people's rates are going up?
Yeah.
I think it depends on, so rates and values work in conjunction to bills, right? So if you're seeing a big increase in value, you don't need to raise rates as much to see the same tax bill.
Right.
So when thinking about the rise in property values, if the property value after the application of the CLA is quite high, then even with the property tax rates increasing by only up to 5%,
Yeah.
you can still see a big increase in the tax bill.
And in theory, in local government, we used to have to explain it. If your grand list goes up and you raise the same amount of money as last year, you should be able to lower your tax rate.
Right.
And in general, that there's always outliers. There's always some group of homes. But yeah, it should take a lower rate to raise the same tax bill. And
So I guess what we're saying then is this is such a perfect storm that even with the huge increase in property values, that hasn't done much to put a dent in the increase, the rate.
And this, I don't think figures in any of the municipal taxes. I mean, Montpelier is talking 3 to 4%. There's gonna be, and I think our smaller towns haven't even gotten their head around it. But there, in the towns that were hit by the floods, there's likely to be a significant increase in the local property tax just to make up for all the revenue they lost when they were in the water. So,
Your bill's gonna,
no, my bill's not gonna fix that. What, right now, those houses are underwater, the people come in for tax abatement. Town abates them, so it comes off the grand list. The law right now says that despite that, they still have to pay the full school tax to the state of Vermont. What the bill, I think we're gonna do it on Monday, that I've put in and Representative Kornheiser's put in is what we did after Irene, which said, you abate these houses because they're underwater, you don't have to pay the school tax to the state.
you would use them for rainy day fund to fill that gap.
That hasn't been put in anywhere.
Well, that's what we did.
Okay, well,
That's what the bill we did for Irene was, we had a rainy day fund and we made it the rainy day after fund.
Well, I didn't remember that.
I don't remember that either, but I've never been on appropriations, and that's where that would have to happen.
Oh, that's the,
Yeah,
as to the extent that I helped to be an architect of that bill
Yeah.
and convince people to do it.
okay,
That's what it did.
okay.
So what, there's some.
We can, well, that would have to be dealt with in appropriations, and the projections use up any rainy day funds that are in any surpluses we have in the ed fund, so it would have to come out of the general fund rainy day. And I don't know what we did, but we can talk about that and find out. That did not come up in any of the discussions that I was part of, but I'd like to get that bill out if possible, because we'd like to let the towns involved know that that expense of paying the tax to the state they're not gonna have to budget that. So that will give them minimal, but they're gonna need a lot more help, some of them to come out.
So we're basically self-insuring in a way, like we're just saying, okay, there are not enough towns will be short that much money that when we, on a statewide level, we can raise the money to sort of make whole those towns, fulfill their
This
contribution.
isn't going to make them whole at all. They have still lost a significant portion of their grand list. They just don't have to pay a tax to the state on the property that isn't on their grand
Yeah,
list.
I mean, I misstated, I really should be to make the state whole for revenues if it is foregoing by virtue
Well, and
of paying
what was,
the town obligation.
it was a very low cost to this. Do you remember it?
1.1 million.
Yeah, which is what we would lose in the ed fund.
That's the estimate that we've come into in consensus with the administration in FY24.
So in the whole, it's not a lot of money in the ed fund, but it will help the towns, not penalize, the towns essentially for losing property to flooding or maybe a tornado next.
And it sounds like the towns were probably pretty judicious about who they abated. You know, they've
Well,
already.
that
had
was
to
the
make
other
tough
part,
decisions.
that boards of civil authority were getting put in a really tough position because if they abated property, if we still had to pay
Mhm.
the state, you were just causing their neighbors' tax rates to go up that much more. So we hoped that this would allow them to make,
You were to own the restaurant.
Mhm.
And it was assessed on the 1st of April. And the restaurant wasn't there come November tax time.
Mhm.
You owed the money, your tax bill on that restaurant.
Mhm.
What happened after Irene is we took the rainy day fund to say the money that you would have owed that disappeared,
Mhm.
was made up
Right,
from the ed fund.
yeah.
Um,
We gotta have 1 million in
That's
the
what
rainy
you
day
refer
fund,
to
right?
as abating the taxes, and the other way of saying it is the restaurant wasn't there, and the town's share was being made up from the rainy day fund.
okay, well, if you can find out where that rainy day fund is, we have a required reserve in
We keep from the
the,
reserve,
it was from the reserve.
Statutory
Is-
reserve.
and we took it out of the first of the 3 payments that went to school districts. We used the reserve from that.
Okay.
Payments.
Wasn't here during Irene, so,
Yeah, yes, you want.
not in this,
Okay, but in
it
the
was down the hall.
Jeff Spalding was the Secretary of Administration at the time.
Well, we may be able to work that out. I've talked with both the tax commissioner, no one has made a suggestion. And aren't we required, we are required to have a certain reserve, right?
In the education
In the
fund?
education fund.
So there is a requirement within the education fund, the amount for a stabilization reserve, the amount is,
Self-imposed.
yeah, so it's, the recommendation to maintain the bond rating of the state is 5% of the prior year's net appropriations.
Okay, and that is the bond rating. So the question would be, have we got more than that in there? I think on occasion, we have drawn that reserve down. And that isn't counted in the December 1st letter, right? Because
And
that's,
so, sorry,
no, I just say that's, the bond rating likes to know we have enough in reserve to cover our costs if something unexpected
Like a
happens.
flood.
And this might qualify, and we could look at that. So as we go through, we'll look on that.
That's really, if I could chime in, so to your earlier question, Chair, I'm really trying to understand if this is a rainy enough day, if this is just the direction, the new normal, or if this is a one-off, and if it does qualify for a rainy day to use from the reserves. I need to better understand what levers we have and how much of the rainy day fund actually exists, and what that other line that you're about to talk about, the prior year stabilization reserve, are those monies potentially, acknowledging it could affect our bond ratings?
Yep.
Could we use those
That's
for
what-
this year to stabilize the rates for our taxpayers?
I would defer to ledge counsel if there's something legally to be concerned about on that. I would encourage, to have Kirby Keaton in to talk about that. I will say that taking funds out of the stabilization reserve, I guess I will leave it at that. I think it's more of a question for
I
ledge
mean,
counsel.
that we'll have to talk to the treasurer, the bonding people. And the other question is, I doubt there's enough, what we always try to avoid, and the Senate's been more conservative than the House, is to prevent an 18% increase. And mostly it's been when we've had a surplus, and it was an unanticipated surplus, we got more money. Special ed was one that went over a couple of years. And the Senate has always tried to not drop it. And if this is going to be an ongoing situation. If we drop the 18, if we can find enough money to drop it, and the next year it's 20%. So we got to try and get a handle on what is driving the ed fund. I think we know that the declining number of students is playing a role. We tried mandating mergers and we got some, but we haven't had the impact. And we also have some fairly wealthy towns that can afford to vote budgets and some fairly poor towns that can't, even though most of their people are income sensitized. And they're all gonna pay, it's all in the same pot.
Well, that was kind of my next question, is I know that we're trying to get better information from tax on what the breakdown is from non-homestead property tax, but we know the categories, right? Like, could you take row C and break it down further by commercial or residential, non-primary residence, et cetera?
You wrote two non-homestead education property tax source.
I suppose that I was just looking at uniform non-homestead property tax rate. But they're the same,
Okay.
they're the same category. Just can we take non-homestead property tax and tease it apart more?
Very intrigued in that.
Yeah, so last year, there was a bill that was passed for the tax department to issue a report
Mhm.
examining exactly that. While there are currently categories, so to speak, in the grand list, they're not spelled out in statute what those
Okay.
categories are.
Okay.
And they're created more for the process of the equalization study and calculating CLAs
Yeah.
and not for taxation
Right.
groups.
Right.
And so it's not delineated out to listers, how to categorize a property.
Okay.
And they're put into those categories like based on the best use of the property and not necessarily how they're being used. It's a pretty standard practice in terms of like how to assess land.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why we do current use, because it's highest and best use, and most agricultural land would be perfect for putting housing and commercial buildings on.
Everybody wants to be on land that doesn't have rocks in it. It deals with septic well.
And so the assessors did it
I have
by
a
best
list of
use.
things.
And
Okay.
Very expensive.
But I'm trying to go back to basics, so I have a really clear understanding. So someone's still paying the non-homestead rate if they don't pay income taxes here, they're paying the non-homestead rate.
This isn't their residence.
Right, and so the people who say they're 6 months and a day in Florida, they are paying the non-homestead rate, even if the best use would be a year-round homestead. That's not what you're saying, but.
So the value of the property
Mhm.
is the highest and best use, or I don't know the technical term, but it's
Mhm.
basically like the highest use of the property, is the way
Right.
that it's assessed.
Right.
Someone pays the homestead property tax if they file a homestead declaration with the city saying this is my principal dwelling.
Yes.
The non-homestead captures all other properties. So yes, it's
Yes.
folks with second homes, it's apartment buildings, it's businesses, it's manufacturing plants, it's everything that is not homestead.
And if I may, that's what I would love to spend more time on as a legislature, because if we could have different levers on those different
Right.
categories within there, I think we could have even more fair
That's what
property
the
taxation.
tax department was supposed to do in the study, is break out what are those different groups, and I assume how many of them, because if
But it's
it's
due next year, but we're getting an interim report this year?
is that what's going on? Yeah.
I see a lot of opportunity there.
I
I mean, this
agree.
was the second year of the biennium. We normally don't make huge tax changes in the second year.
I think
But we made
it's an election year where we may wanna make
Well,
tax changes.
yeah. I mean, this much of an increase in the property tax is not normal. I hope it won't be normal, and we may be able to find, I mean, I don't think we can change the the divisions and get it through both bodies in 10 weeks. We can try.
We could try.
We can try.
You have two very Pollyannish people on this committee who want to try.
So, yeah, right.
Okay, I mean, we'll give it a try. We need to first understand what is happening. And then if it's ongoing or it's a blip, and if it's a blip, we can do a temporary fix. I'll go over to the bank across the hall.
But I think it's fair to say our other sources of revenue are doing the best they can. You know, it's not because of a big drop in any of our sources of revenue. They've all gone up considerably.
Yeah. No, it isn't that any other, the housing market hasn't crashed. So, yeah.
It's the pressure of
seen
spending.
a drop in grand list.
If I may respond to that point,
Yeah.
that, so these, the non-property tax revenue sources, exactly, they are growing. There is going to be a new forecast coming out in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Something that's also, I think, helpful to keep in mind is when we look at the growth in these non-property tax revenue sources, we're seeing growth of like 4%, 5%, and then we're looking at the growth in expenditures.
Right.
As you said, we're seeing 12% in education spending, additional pressures like universal meals and English learner categorical aids.
Yeah.
So those are all policy decisions. So when you see a greater increase in the expenditures,
And yes, and universal meals has gone in, and they're all good things, but this is when the rubber hits the road, the cost shows up. And, we'll go see what we see. Okay. Anything else on here we should know, anything that's changed?
I'll just say very quickly, the appropriations, these are the estimated appropriations. They are subject to change based on BAA, and then as the different policy deliberations are considered, subject to go up or down based on those policy decisions. And a number of these, especially the categorical aid, are formulaic and written into statute how they're calculated.
And you've got the PCB in there.
Right, so the legislature set aside the 32 million a couple of years ago for the PCB remediation grants, and then at the last year, all of those funds were appropriated to the Agency of Education for PCB grants. So there's no money left in the PCB additional reserve.
And we just put that aside because we did have a big surplus and we knew the PCB was coming. The House wanted to wait until we got the facilities report back, which I guess we have, and I guess it has a very high number on it. So that in news, so it has come back to, I think, the Housing Committee.
$105 billion.
Yeah. Representative Condon looked pretty shocked in the picture. I mean, that's the cost of an ideal world. But we're gonna have to say how much money we're gonna put into a K-6 school that has 10 kids in it. I mean, some of those decisions are gonna have to be made. But that hasn't hit yet. Okay.
Thanks. Can you hold forth a little bit on line 27? We have the $27.5 million shortfall. What is that?
Sure, yeah, so, and these are the lines that I also think is especially helpful to reference the annotated guide because it spells out what's being calculated to get these numbers. The way, these lines are really to help more people with accounting minds think about how funds are flowing, and they shouldn't be used too much in terms of intuition. So this is really saying that there's more uses than there are sources coming into the ed fund this year. And you can think about, well, why is that? In part, it's because at the close of FY '24, after updating closeout and seeing what revenues, there was about 24 million on the bottom line there. So that can be put towards not needing to raise as much money on property tax rates. Does that make sense?
No,
Okay.
it's not to me, probably everyone else.
If you need to spend what we had this year, as you said, to reduce it.
We had, yeah, we had allocated everything, but when the actual costs come in, then there's some money that we allocated that didn't get spent. That's what happened in special ed 3 years in a row where we had I think appropriations allocated extra money and the schools didn't use it, so we had a surplus, which we thought was a one-time. It turned out to be a 2 or 3 time thing, and that was when all the discussions about do you use it all to drop tax rates this year.
Exactly. There's, at the close of a fiscal year, this whole time we're working with estimates, right? We're working with the revenue forecast. So the economists don't know down to the penny how much money, for instance, is going to come in sales and use.
Right.
So once the fiscal year closes out and we see, okay, well, actually more money came in than the economists were forecasting, we have a little bit more funds on the bottom line that the General Assembly didn't put towards anything or put into any reserves. So those funds have now been carried over into the current fiscal year and have been used, as you can sort of think about it, as another revenue source. The legislature also set aside last year 13 million as what was called the tax rate offset reserve. So those 13 million were also used. So those are 13 million that don't need to be raised by property taxes because the legislature carved them out last year, set them aside so the property taxes wouldn't be high.
So anything that was left on the bottom line has been used in the numbers of the December 1st letter.
Exactly, that's what you're seeing in line 39 there.
But not the reserves,
At the stabilization.
not the stabilization reserve.
We put the money, the reserves for the PCB aside, but that was a separate set aside reserve. It was allocated to these potential future costs.
And that is the 5%, like that's what the 47 million is the 5%.
Yeah, so for FY '25, to have the stabilization reserve be kept at the 5% that it's traditionally kept at is
Yeah.
55.6.
Okay.
And so we're assuming here in the modeling that, yes, you are putting that money, you are keeping that money aside, holding it over here, carving it away, and then the rest is going in.
And if you use it, you have to plan to return it. So next year, it's like all the money we borrowed, joint fiscal did this summer to help in flood relief. We took $20 million from broadband, that was money that was set aside for bidding on federal
Okay.
things. And so the budget adjustment this year, one of them is going to have to return 20 million to the broadband fund, and we rated something else
Yeah.
to get some money to deal with immediate emergencies.
I'm just saying, if I was taking this chart to my constituents before the school budget was voted, their little pre-town meeting school budget, the only thing I would say is we can change that non-homestead property tax. Like, I don't think people would argue with what we're spending the money on.
But I think if we do that, it won't help this year, right? Because you can't do a tax retroactively.
But you could if you were gonna borrow the reserve and pay it back with that.
Yes, you could do.
They can also painfully shoot down their budgets. They can also painfully vote no on their budgets.
Yes,
Which they've got.
but that's the question is, is that a one-time expense because you had to give everybody a 7% raise and next year they're not getting 7%? Yeah,
Right.
and is it, because if we spend everything and this just keeps going up, if this is a one-time event,
Yeah.
yeah, then we could get ourselves through and we could have a plan for where we're gonna get the money to put it back. But I'm not sure the reserve is enough to bring down that rate. I didn't think so.
55 million. How much is like, is there a way to think,
Could we get
okay,
it to
10 million buys down X percent?
So-
Is it a penny? Yeah.
Traditionally, it has been. The challenge of using that,
Yeah.
which has been a really helpful tool in the past, is this year we have the 5% tax rate caps.
Oh, yeah.
So the intuition of a penny is 10 million doesn't apply now because it's the tax rate cap introduces another layer of complexity
Okay.
in terms of tax rates.
Something. Anyway.
What time is it?
About for 8 more minutes.
Oh, 8 more minutes, okay.
Well, isn't there a historical aspect? Because we've talked in this committee for many, many years as to whether or not 5% reserve is sufficient. And that goes back to a lot of things that, you know, audit examinations of our past results have raised that question, that in the event that we get into trouble, is 5% enough, or should we have been at least gradually raising our reserve target for some years now?
Yeah. I mean, if we're gonna rate it, then we're gonna need something else. I mean, and schools, they may vote down their budgets faced with an 18% threat. Many of them probably will, especially if you're throwing in some significant town, at least a couple towns, increases. But if they don't vote to fix the school this year, that cost is still hanging out there. If, you know, and I think that's what some of my schools are worried about, they're capped at 5%. But after 5 years, if just their labor cost is eating up that 5%, in order to do any kind of school, educational improvement, they've been artificially capped, so at the end, and if the yield continues to go down, it's gonna be a massive tax increase to just break even. And so and that's the question, what is in those school budgets? And we'll ask the superintendents, what's in their budgets? Is this a one-time expense that kick off till next year? It's gonna have to be paid.
Yeah.
Probably most of it. Okay. Thank you. You left us all uplifted for flood recovery. Okay, we're gonna have, this one is gonna take a lot of time and effort, I think, to go through it.
Is the number something you're able to come back with about how much $10 million buys into bringing down rate? Or are you saying too many variables would move when you did that you would?
Yeah, so more the latter. If there were not to be the 5% tax rate cap, then we could say a little bit more than 10 million corresponds with a penny. It's closer to 12.
Okay.
But because of the 5% cap,
Yeah.
The way that impacts different school districts rates, and then how much money is being pulled from those grand lists.
Yeah.
Depends on everything else that's happening.
So we'll know after town meeting. No, still.
As long as the 5% cap is in play, using the mental math of 1 penny is on both tax rates is about 10 million, doesn't work because of the 5%
Right,
cap.
because that community is still held harmless.
Exactly, so then
Got
it doesn't necessarily correspond with all the value in that
Okay.
community's grant list.
At some point, when that 5% cap goes away,
Yeah.
there's likely possibly going to be a huge unfunded mandate out there that, I mean, if they borrowed and put off necessary expenses to keep it under that 5, that I think is what they're concerned about is, you know, in what are we, year 1 or 2, that they will have a huge increase. So we'll keep working on this. Next week, we have the schools, or some of the schools coming in, and I've asked them to tell us what they're looking at financially, what kind of pressures they're seeing, how are they reading their communities, and we'll, you know, we can go from there, and then we'll have a better idea of what are the pressures that are driving them. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just not easy to explain what you explained today.
Thank you.
Well done.
That is the highest praise.
I was gonna say, that's so
That's
nice. Thank you. That's so nice of you.
Take care.
Bottle that up.
Okay. Yeah, come on up. I think we've only got one couple. I don't, both want to come up or
Yeah,
grab a chair?
offered us small support.
We only have one comfortable one. Welcome. I'm hoping we can give us some good news, but I think some of us are also looking at the possibility that we might have to help out some of the towns to survive this too, so. Floor is yours.
For the record, Douglas Farnham, I'm the Chief Recovery Officer for the state of Vermont. Douglas Farnham, Policy Director for the Recovery Office. So what I was hoping to do today was talk a little bit about the numbers, set like a 1.5, 2-page kind of summary that lays out some of our some of the liabilities that we're looking at the state level. Some of those are commingled with municipal liabilities, of course. And I also set a larger kind of really high level deck about flood recovery and how really high level sketch of how the state's organizing a little bit, approaching flood recovery, but happy to dive into any elements of that and talk through flood recovery. So starting with the event itself, right? We all know massive storm. We've had many presentations at this point on the size of the storm and many committees and contexts. There's still ongoing huge impacts from the storm, so it's not like it's not over at this point still, right? We're still trying to manage both the mental health, the human safety aspects of the flooding. A lot of that has been exacerbated by the lack of housing stock that we went into the flood with. Basically zero rental vacancies in many communities that had hundreds of units that were damaged in the flood.
Can I ask a clarifying
Yes,
question?
Senator.
Is this presentation going to set aside entirely the December flood?
I can speak a little bit, Senator, in high level terms about the December flood, but it doesn't include any of the numbers or impacts of the December flood.
Okay.
But I do know that we're still in the scoping process for damages from December from a public assistance perspective. So that means state non-highway or municipal public assistance eligible damage. We exceeded $2 million. So we are likely to see some type of disaster filing request with FEMA there. But we are very unlikely to hit individual assistance thresholds. So one of the downsides of Vermont's geography, I'm a 7th generation Vermonter. I love Vermont. I grew up in a couple miles from Groton Forest. I love the mountains, but the mountains cause concentrated weather. And so we see pockets of damage, unlike states in the South and other places where they see widespread types of the same damage. We see very inconsistent damage from a lot of our events. And December was more along the lines of that inconsistent damage where Moortown, for example, saw some pretty significant impacts to individuals Whereas we didn't see the widespread impact to individuals from December, but we did see concentrated pockets of dangerous situations. There were 12 swiftwater rescues in the December event, so 12 people that may have died without that intervention by the swiftwater teams. So certainly a significant event, $2 million worth of damage. The July events so far are in the $600 million range. So as far as match goes, right now we are at that 25% rate, but that's only until we cross $112 million of formally obligated funds with FEMA. And that really means we've gone back and forth with FEMA. They agree what was damaged. They agree what it will cost to repair. And then they formally obligate those funds to us. They agree to pay us those funds. I was hoping to hit that 112 million of obligation in January, which is now in. But now it's looking like, because we don't want to rush to agree with some on FEMA with certain things, we want to make sure we're getting the right amount of reimbursement for our damages. It's probably going to be more in the March, April timeframe that we actually officially cross that. Once we officially cross that obligation threshold, then FEMA can administratively adjust the cost share from 75%, 25 to 90, 10. And that not only helps us with our direct state damage, but it also helps us with the municipal damage that we have an agreement through the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund to help municipalities with their share of FEMA match.
Thanks. The quick question I have is, so on shifting from 25/75 to 90/10, is it just marginal allocations after that, or does the ratio shift all the way back to first dollar?
So 90/10 is the only adjustment we'll get. Unfortunately, there's no more benefit in going. So
I mean, is it once you cross 112, like now the 90/10 applies to the margin,
No, I understand
additional
your question better.
expenditure, as opposed to they say, oh, well, this was bad enough. We should have been doing 90/10 from day one.
That's one thing that drives all of our financial people crazy, Senator. It goes back to the entire event. So it goes back to the first dollar. So
it's a good way to be driven crazy.
Yes, it is. It is a good problem to have. There's also, this is very good news. We got category A and category B, which is debris and protective measures. Those are at 100% for 30 days of the governor's designation, which may end up being the first 30 days from declaration. But we really need the financials in so we can look at that and make the best financial decision for the state. So we won't have any match on that portion.
And the other thing is, the mantra from Irene, and I assume really still, is Build Back Better, right? And so the best instance I know of that is culverts, things that got worse. You know, we were switching, we're in the process of switching all over entirely to hydrologically engineered culverts everywhere. But so I'm guessing we had some non-hydrologically engineered culverts wiped out. They were insufficient. And then when we tried to build the better, much more expensive culvert back, last time with Irene, they said, no, we'll only pay you to build what you have. You can't build back better. We won't contribute towards the more expensive culvert. Is that still the rules of the game?
We're not completely out of the woods there, Senator, but since Irene, the Vermont legislature, and well, I think Vermont Emergency Management might have even been created after Irene. But through the efforts of Vermont Emergency Management and the state legislature, we now have much more official codes and standards that FEMA is obligated under their regulations to follow. So that $600 million estimate is the cost, not just to replace what was there, but to replace it with what hits current codes and standards, which are much more advanced and much better. About half of the total damage of the event is related to the Montpelier complex. So the mechanical damage in 109, 133, extremely extensive, extremely difficult to mitigate. I toured it shortly after the flooding, and hopefully this isn't too much levity, but the mechanicals in the basement of 133 reminded me of like a Batman villain's hideout. Like, you kept going down And I was like, how are we not at the bottom of this room? We kept going down and there were expensive machines and there were panels with lights on them. And I was like, I worked in that building for a decade and I was like, what is all of this craziness? And it's literally, $100 million worth of mechanicals in that basement that was below ground level.
Now it's destroyed.
Yes. So it's temporary reoperational based on a permit from fire safety. They've done what they need to make it able to operate, but under code, it has to be replaced. It has to be brought up to above base flood elevation.
Wow, so where do you put all that stuff?
In many cases, so one of our goals, the $600 million is an estimate of what it will cost, the capital complex being half of that. And there could be a couple approaches. One would be to mitigate in place, right? You lose space within that building's footprint, within the first floor. In Waterbury, all the mechanicals were brought up to the first floor. I know you're very familiar with the Waterbury measures. The other way is to look for a place to house those mechanicals that's outside of the floodplain. There's some slope right near 133 that potentially could do that. There's utility tunnels that could be used to. So there's probably 3 or 4 major scenarios that PGS is working on constructing that would be presented to Senate and House institutions and then help them pick the best path. But the amount of money that's required for any of those is about the same. It's still astronomical. Yes.
Can I ask one more question? This is sort of a curiosity question. Is there not such a thing as like this industrial sump pump that keep basement, like pavilion, seriously, like pumped out, like so you don't flood, or is it the scale at which speed at which water comes in, it's just, there is no system that can handle that?
So that's a great question, Senator, and it actually speaks to the way that our world is changing a little bit. One thing, Irene was a very different event from this event, right? It was fluvial erosion. It was a heavy hit of water that caused destruction as it came through. This event was sustained raining and an inundation event to the point where the water tables, the rivers, there was nowhere for the water to go. So BGS was running pumps. They have pumps, but the pumps were overwhelmed and the pumps ran out of somewhere to go.
Yeah.
There's actually a massive air vent under 133 from when National Life had a cooling shed, and that was completely filled with water. And I think when the water table and when you have to plan for events that are going to overwhelm the water table,
Yeah.
that's where pumps no longer function because there's no water for the water to go.
Yeah. The outlet will be on the 5th floor.
Okay.
Yeah, I imagine you've looked at the postmortem from Irene. I've been looking a lot at that, or I did after July. It looks right now like less federal money for this flood than what we received at the end of the day. It was something like between 550 and 600 million from the federal government after Irene. Am I reading that wrong? Do you have an estimate of
so,
all?
Senator.
Okay.
Yeah, so the numbers the numbers with Irene and the numbers with this event are amazingly convoluted and very confusing to me still as well. So narrowing it down to specifically public assistance eligible damages. So
Yes.
the infrastructure that we're talking about right now, Irene had 216 million of that category.
Okay.
So if you adjust that to today's dollars, that'd be roughly $300 million. We have 600 million of that category of damage. So we have twice.
Non-individual.
Non-individual.
Okay.
So Irene, a lot of the stories published $700 million of damage from Irene.
Mhm.
That was comprehensive damage.
Okay.
State, business,
Got it.
individual.
So this includes no businesses and no families.
So businesses are estimated, very, very rough estimate, at above 300 million of damage.
Okay.
A large concentration in central Vermont and Lamoille counties. Individuals, that's one thing my team is going to look at is, can we get a better estimate of individual losses? maybe through the insurance data. We looked at the FEMA data. They did not have total losses. They only have losses they decided were losses in coverage.
Which is minuscule,
It's $24 million essentially. Which I would not be surprised based on the number of structures impacted, if the individual damage was somewhere between 100 million and 300 million. I think it could be on par with the business damage. 150 million of federal highways damage. Now, I need actually to sharpen my pencil around what the match requirements are. My understanding, which hopefully is not wrong, is that a lot of federal highway emergency repair is 100%. We don't have a cost share associated with that. And that, so it doesn't cause as much of a budget pressure as FEMA public assistance does. But that's 150 million of federal highways. I haven't gotten a financial request from Agency of Transportation yet, so, but it could be baked into their existing project budgets. And then there was one other type of damage that I was trying to remember. No, sorry.
Municipal?
The municipal, out of the 600 million, the municipal is roughly 200 million. That's about how it carves out right now. It's still fluctuating pretty heavily, but they're in the range of 200 million of uncovered damages. So the rough cut that I've been working on with Ted Brady is at the LCT is roughly 20 million of municipal match. Because of the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, that creates a roughly $10 million burden on the state's Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, because we cover on average about half of municipal match.
Do schools get folded into municipal?
They do, yes. I paused because I know that the ERAF, the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund rule, is organized at the town level, and I don't actually know how that translates to school district match, because they cross multiple borders. That's a project, that's some research that I have to do. So.
You want to finish it on?
I don't have anything specific to finish.
So there are all these dollars exclusive of the National Flood Insurance Program payments that Vermonters may receive. And I don't know if Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, sorry, if those monies are only to citizens, or if businesses are eligible for that same insurance, municipalities can insure that way. You know what's going on the insurance side, national flood, federal, flood insurance.
I know that all of our buildings, Senator, had an NFIP policy.
Yeah.
I think it was a $500,000 cap. We had a cap for the building and a cap for contents. All of these numbers that I'm trying to give you are after backing insurance payments out of it. So that's money that
need still.
Yes.
And we are going to talk to DFR, and they will help us have a program on flood insurance, which apparently, since we haven't had floods in Vermont, there are scarce people who are experts, but they have contacts in Washington, and if we can come up with specific questions, they said it would make it easier to get a presentation, but we're gonna have a talk.
S213, which we just started in today, river corridors, wetlands, dams, etc. One of the things we're looking at is changing statutory regulations to ensure that every town ends up eligible for National Flood Insurance Program. Because if you don't meet certain criteria, then you don't have bylaws for your flood hazard areas. If you haven't promulgated those, then your town's ineligible for the program. So besides improving the way the program, besides the state managing corridors better, we could also help ensure that everyone in a corridor is eligible for the insurance.
So yeah, and the more disasters we have, the more stress that fund has been getting, so.
Right.
But we will at least get an elementary understanding of national flood insurance. And then I know I've had a constituent who FEMA helped, probably during Irene, because the section would flood a lot. Moved his electric box. Got hit again this year. And they said, nope, you're not eligible because you don't have flood insurance. He says, I do, it's with Lloyd's of London. Well, that didn't count. You had to have their federal program. So he couldn't get any help from FEMA this time because, so he's taking a buyout.
Yeah, we've definitely had a number of issues related to flood insurance. In some cases, owners who weren't notified when they bought the property, the last owner got a FEMA payout and had, or got individual assistance, not a payout. Because they only got up to $37,000, right? But that created an obligation for that property to be in the flood insurance program under FEMA's rules. And the new owner didn't know that, didn't have insurance, and was still denied individual assistance.
So maybe while we're requiring that renters be notified if they're in the floodplain, that there be some record that there is a requirement for flood insurance. If you get a mortgage, you have to have a flood clearance. You have to, so you know if you're in the floodplain or not, even though those are not accurate anymore. But yeah, you wouldn't know.
And I do know that FEMA's working on updating the floodplain maps. The current ones are, hit or miss. Unhelpful. But we're not sure how that will go,
Yeah.
how helpful the next round will be.
In our hearing, we heard they're still gonna be 10 years old for the most part. They will not include anything from the events of the last decade.
Yes. So, that's national program. I'm gonna do Senator McCormick.
How far are we falling short of this? The governor has asked us to keep the budget down to a 3% or 3.5% increase, keep it at inflation. If we did that, would we be able to pay all the state's share of this?
So making this balance out, especially when you roll in the amount we'll need to help contribute to property buyouts, for which I think in many cases end up being the right thing to do, both for the state and for the individual homeowner, and for larger mitigation projects like floodplain mitigation. It's gonna be, I know we're still working on it, it's gonna be very difficult to find that between the PA and the budget. And I think one thing I'm looking at is how do our ARPA programs overlap with what we're gonna need to do as resilience? And is there something creative we can do there? So that's not ready to go yet, but it should be part of the budget presentation that even if we can't get to every cent reconciled right now, this is how we hope to get there.
Senator Bray left.
Yeah, so, I think the last part of what you said is a really hopeful direction for the conversation. If you have, I don't even know how many staff are in your office.
I've stolen 5 staff.
Because you're considered half-time. So you have 5 half-time people who are sharing with others.
Well, actually, I was able to create one living service position to act as a financial and operations manager.
Okay.
Because most of the
Okay,
numbers
yeah.
are in my head.
Right.
And so we want to get them down in spreadsheets
Right.
and documents and everything.
We're still scheduling the DLL to get Charles, and my poor committee assistant was like, did I do the wrong thing? So you have 4 half-time.
And then, so we have 2 limited service positions that are holdovers from ARPA, the ARPA state fiscal recovery positions.
Okay.
But they already had a mostly full-time job with keeping up with ARPA.
Okay.
So they're gonna help me with resilience, but they didn't really have much additional bandwidth to take on new stuff. And then we've designated a recovery officer in each agency to make sure we have an accountable point of contact so that I don't have to go to each section and say, hey,
Yes.
this is recovery related,
Right.
like Kimberly Baker at A&R helps me resolve recovery issues.
Right.
And then, we appointed Pat Moulton, Central Vermont
Yes.
Recovery Officer.
That's right.
And Todd Eaton and Holly Hayden from Agency of Transportation are temporarily
Okay.
a percentage reassigned to act as Northern and Southern Vermont recovery officers. And then Eric Philhorn
Yeah,
from
that's
DGS. I've stolen Eric entirely, and he's my liaison with the federal government right now.
Okay.
Because they require a lot of time.
Yes.
So,
Well, if I may put 4 things on your radar that we've heard in the morning, that are related to, I would say they're related to this, but it might just help Charles or whoever is gonna sort of take the lead on helping us answer questions in economic development. I imagine you have some kind of, like a board that you're meeting, I don't know, like people from each affected community that you're trying to bring together to talk once in a while. You know, certainly some of the folks we talked to don't feel like they have that direct link, and I don't wanna, your office was stood up, I don't even know how long ago, but if someone can watch our testimony from the morning, it might be helpful. A lot of things came up that are common themes. The 4 things I just wanted to mention, 3 are quite specific, and 1 I think relates to what you said last. So number 1, question for next week, if you don't have the answer now, is can you take a buyout and move your physical structure of your house somewhere else? And we also have a federal delegation in the same day you're coming in. 2, could the state pay people they believe are on track to get things like a buyout or individual assistance, but it's taking a long time, and then be paid back by FEMA, or do a loan and that person individually pays back the state when they get their FEMA money? So is there a way to get people money more quickly from a state revolving loan fund? 3, folks just said they are overloaded with emails about how to apply for any funding, and you know, they just like, they're a select board member who's retired in Weston and they're getting hundreds of emails, and they it's like happenstance if they figure out which one gets them money.
We have a lot of sympathy with them.
Yes. And then the bigger question that we heard really loud and clear today was like, we don't want to spend any money until we know which direction we're going in. Are we rebuilding exactly what we had, or are we creating a whole new vision for our community and moving things? And we don't have the expertise to do that, and the state funding isn't clear, or it might be contradictory to what FEMA's saying. So I'm heartened to hear you say, you know, there's this focus on like, how do we put the money toward building back better? But you know, that's where I look at these numbers and think damage and repair. They're saying like, we don't want to put our fire station back right where it was, which I'm sure you're hearing too. So what do these numbers represent vis-a-vis what you're hearing are the transition plans?
right, so, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But one thing I would say is, for a specific project, so a fire station that was damaged in a place where it shouldn't go, the towns have as much support as they need for the FEMA application process from the VEM right now as they can get. I have a contract to provide additional resources, so any town that asks for more support will get more support.
When you say more support,
Talking with FEMA and defining the project and making sure.
okay, because for them, it's like, even if you gave me a grant to do this, I can't find the person.
Right.
So some have like a retired FEMA
Right.
person in their community who's been amazing compared to the town next door. They're like, well, who do we find to do
Yeah.
this?
And then,
So you say they're getting the support, like someone from your office?
I would say some towns are availing themselves out, like we gave Marshfield an extremely large amount of support because they engaged with us. Other towns don't know that they can engage with us, so we've been trying to reach people and trying to let them know.
Okay.
But that's only specific to the FEMA public assistance.
Reach out to Jamaica and Londonderry and Weston.
We've been working with Jamaica a lot recently, but we can reach out and connect with them more.
Okay.
We know that we want to set up a regional floodplain discussion in the Jamaica area.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the phase we're moving into this year in the medium plan, in long-term planning is what can we do in the regional floodplains in the watershed management? And that needs to be organized at the regional level, and so we can provide a framework for those discussions. Part of that is pursuing to see if we can get any federal grants to fund that, so that we don't have to come up with the money to do that process ourselves. And that's one thing we've been working with FEMA on is can we find any funding there? But yeah, so for the more complex, like community redesign hazard mitigation conversations, there's not an existing high level of support for those.
Okay.
Right? But if you received $200,000 of damage, or probably more than that, $1 million of damage to your fire department, and you don't want to rebuild it there is a process that's onerous and that the state will support the municipality in doing of getting an alternate project approved with FEMA, where that money can go towards building a new structure. But again, you need to be able to come up with the plans to build that project somewhere else, and that's where the community
Really the gap,
need help.
yeah.
So for municipal technical assistance money that was approved in the BAA, was appropriated in the BAA last year.
Last year.
Yeah, it is last year now. For this fiscal year, right? That $3 million we've approved providing support to more communities with that and to providing support for flood impacted communities. So because it can be used for community resilience planning and mitigation work, the is a source. If we don't have another funding channel, that money can be used to support. Like Weston made a request, and we're going to fund support for Weston.
They're very heartened, but I mean, I'm sure Natural Resources is hearing this too. Like, it's almost as though if you spent $3 million to get experts into like if the state had a team of hydraulic engineers and experts going into the communities, they'd be better off than their $50,000 to find someone to do that.
I'll be very blunt with you, Senator. I think a lot of communities would balk at a state expert coming in and telling them what they should be doing. I think part of it is controlling trust. And I think that's the other element. We need to figure out how to help people with resources that they trust.
Yeah.
Guide them, give them the best advice possible.
Listen to all of our
balance.
testimony, because every single person said, we don't even know where to get technical assistance. We're asking for help.
Yeah, and we've definitely been getting that feedback and continue to get it and continue to try to point people towards resources. But I do think people are overloaded and saturated right now.
Oh, yeah, that's it. I've heard across the board is the crisis is immediate. Your house is gone, your business is gone. But getting help is slow. It's state bureaucracy, it's federal bureaucracy. You've got a whole state to cover. But one of the witnesses this morning was the Weston Playhouse, significantly damaged. Until they know what's happening with the Weston Dam and their bridge, and they don't know if they should spend money into restoring the Playhouse, or if they should be, I guess they've got another smaller venue up the road. And they're, and other people in town are saying, and until I know what's going to happen, I don't know if I'm going to open.
And I would say, unfortunately, my best advice right now, and Weston did not appreciate it when I gave him this advice, is that you have to assume that there will not be any regional mitigation at this point. We are going to do our best to coordinate and do as much regional mitigation as we can get done, but that's going to take time. That's going to take several years to up to 10 years, right? So if you want to protect yourself and make a decision in your best interest, you can't assume that any regional mitigation is going to be successful. We want to, like I said, we want to push to achieve as much as we can. But if I was a business owner, how are you making that business decision, assuming Montpelier would have the same flood risk as it did this July? And then it's our job at the state and the legislature to do as much as we can to move that needle. But with a changing climate, if you mitigate for the current conditions, even if you do regional mitigation, the conditions might change in a way that your risk actually hasn't been reduced that much.
Would be looking at training fire departments how to fight major forest fires.
Right.
Which we never really had.
So it is painful, but I mean, I do think there will be some great regional mitigation projects. Even the project at Farm Way near Agway, like, that's a great example of finding some floodplain, making sure we're giving the river some space wherever we can.
Can I say one more thing? I don't worry what, but, or I guess it's a question. I mean, it's one thing, I get it. It's one thing to make sure everybody knows they can't count on regional mitigation. It's another to make sure we're doing as much as we can to accelerate that and encourage that. And I think that's where they're looking to us. We don't have county government. We're the population size of a county. So they're saying to us, in some ways, like you said, they don't want to have us come in and tell them what to do. Some of them are saying, you know, like, someone's got to make a decision. Someone's got to say, you know, because FEMA otherwise fills that void and says, oh, you can do this with this money, but you can't do this. The state sort of needs to figure out how it's steering its dollars too. And I know that's painful. We don't like a lot of FEMA's decisions, but, you know, towns are pretty lost right now, and they're doing regional cooperation on their own, is what it sounds like. So they're looking to us for leadership, and I'm sure they're looking to you, and I don't think we can say just like, don't count on regional.
Well, to the individuals and business owners, that's what because Weston Playhouse is a nonprofit, right? To the municipal communities, like the Jamaica area has been coordinating with Stephanie Smith and has been trying to pull that together. I think the A&R River Corridor study is going to give us more data that we need in order to have a productive conversation there. But yes, we do need regional coordination, and part of it is the phasing and where we are at in this moment. We still have towns that are facing FEMA deadlines, that if they don't make those functional deadlines and filing their damage, they lose money and they lose the ability to do these projects. So that's what we've been making sure that we are 100%, as close to 100% as possible on the towns getting their damage complete and clear, and not letting FEMA push the towns around and disqualify damage, etc. So that's the short-term focus. The mitigation conversation has to build off of that. So a lot of the towns want to start that conversation, and it's good that they want to start it, but we need the FEMA damage as a baseline to have that next year conversation. So we do have to compile. So this event will likely create about $80 million of hazard mitigation funding available from FEMA. When we work in, if we were able to match that, all that money, that would be about $100 million of projects. So VEM is going to be trying to scope $100 million of hazard mitigation projects this summer, and by the end of this calendar year. And that's going to be where in the spring and summer, we have to engage with all the municipalities and at the regional level and develop that $100 million project list, preferably more than 100. So if some get turned down, we can, you know, still pull down all the money from FEMA. But I think that's where the frustration is that until we finish the damage assessment stage, we can't really move into the hazard mitigation stage as well. Some communities are ahead of others. Everyone's in kind of a different place right now. And I think that's part of the frustration. But I do know I think we are moving into that phase of setting up the regional structure and having those regional conversations. I've been talking more with Secretary Moore about what's the next step there. I think the question, of course, of can we secure any federal funding for it is a big one.
Sorry, can I just, one more, because I don't want to let go of the kind of left turn answer I got about engineers and like real experts. Do they I mean, maybe, Natural Resources is already talking about this, but do they exist in A&R and we're just assuming nobody wants to talk to them? Are you trying to reach out to national experts who can help? Because everyone we've talked to has said, we don't even know where to look for the firm, the person that can help us do our own mitigation in our own community. Where are those people?
Oh, there's absolutely a shortage of those experts. Yeah,
okay.
No, not disputing that in any way. We've been trying to help provide communities with funds, but there could still be the problem of securing that. So one of the ways is, hopefully we've been trying to strengthen our relationships with some of the contracting firms in that area at the state level. We've also been, through the municipal technical assistance, they can subcontract with their engineering and architecture vendors on behalf of the town. And that cuts out the need for the town to RFP for that. But if it is something that, in VLCT, we've been working with them on templates and how to RFP for different services. But a small town can put out the best RFP in the world and they're not gonna get a response because their project isn't big enough.
And that's where the state needs to fill that gap.
Right, and that's where we've been trying to fill it. That's where we've been blasting out, you know, if a municipality wants assistance, they can submit a municipal technical assistance request and send it to towns, but things that we send to some town officials don't always make it all the way through to the people that are actually working on the project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say our communications are far from perfect there. So yeah, we can definitely explore to see if there are other ways that we can support Jamaica. And I know that we've been working on scheduling a regional floodplain discussion there. So I know we're trying to move that conversation forward.
I think I'm done for now. It's Friday.
Anybody else?
It should be, since we're happily enough, we're crossing committee boundaries. It's a problem that affects so many committees. And so we're in natural resources starting the process of revisiting the whole regulatory scheme, planning regulatory scheme for waterways. They are an integrated aquatic system, regulating them piecemeal and optionally town by town, segment by segment, sometimes a wetland, sometimes a river, sometimes a dam. It's not up to the task of dealing with the climate we have. And so I think, and as much as I'm encouraged by hearing people say, oh, well, we can see that we really need to regulate in a more integrated way. Because no matter how well town A does, if town B is doing something that accelerates water in their direction, they're in trouble, you know. And so we're hearing about it. So but I think all these things will pay off but even if we move really briskly and have a lot of cooperation, it's a really long-term process, you know. I mean, I said to someone, oh, well, this is like a 50-year campaign where it is starting.
Yeah.
It is, and so like, for instance, for communities that need to figure out which direction they want to go, we just signed an agreement with Vermont Council on Rural Development to sponsor 20 more community development sessions over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
So that will
That's
help.
off my list.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's 20 more sessions above what they had already, you know, scheduled and planned to do. And I think, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable for the next 4 or 5 months, particularly for a lot of the communities that got hit really hard and have hard decisions to make. It's cold comfort that we're moving faster than after Irene. Like I said, that's, you know, cold comfort. We kind of learned from Irene, so we hope we can move faster. We've seen that we're moving faster in a lot of ways, but that doesn't help someone much that is living in a house without heat and can't find a place to stay.
Thanks. I apologize for sort of asking a question you've already answered. But in your answer, I got lost in the details. I'm looking now for the Cliff Notes version. All right. If I understood you correctly, you're saying that the state can meet its financial end of recovery, rebuilding, with existing revenues, or are we going to have to raise additional money?
So my understanding, and the budget's not final, is that the budget will look at how much money with current resources we can set aside for match, and what other approaches we might take towards making sure that we can fully utilize those federal programs over the course of those programs without raising additional revenue. So that's the construct that we're working against.
I don't mean to make light of it, but I'm assuming we've set aside a rainy day fund so that we don't have a huge hit and to prepare for just these types of occasions, or we need to some extent, no? $50 million just this year. There hasn't been some sort of set asides over the past 10, 20 years?
I mean, we have just our standard, budgetary like reserves, but depleting those would hurt us with the rating agencies, so
Yeah,
It's a rainy
they're
day.
more operational reserves,
the only
so.
place I've ever been that Vermont has been listed as a red state was when they were rating states according to their ability, their bond ratings, because we did not have the reserves. Part of it was the way we were set up, but we've done a lot of work to do the reserves, but no, that's just, if the bottom falls out and we don't have the money, to run, any of our social welfare programs, we've got a backstop. But we don't have, that I know of, any big set aside for a natural disaster of this magnitude.
And yet, we're one of the few states that always has a balanced budget.
Well, we'll talk about that. There are ways to balance and ways to balance. And sometimes we haven't always made the right choices.
It's true.
I have a quick question. So I know you're in the midst of sort of bailing the boat out, but are we, is someone sort of taking notes and figuring out about how we would develop better emergency response plans for the inevitable next event?
Yes. So right before this, I was in Senate GovOps with Eric Foran. He's the new director of emergency management. He was the deputy director before being appointed. He was interim during the flood, so that was probably a very interesting experience for an interim director. And we do have an after action review process coming up that would likely be in the summer after the summer. But we have been also compiling lessons learned as we go. In some cases, things that were sharp enough of a lesson that we implemented them right away. Like one of the things we did much better this time around than in the past was a centralized state contract for debris, where the municipalities can sign on and there's no financial liability. The state just handles the debris in that community. Because debris from an event needs to be cleaned up. One of the things with flood debris in particular is that it can create elevated risk in future events if it's not addressed. So we handled debris in a much more logical manner this time around. And that actually evolved very quickly, like within the first week after the disaster. We made some pretty quick adjustments.
I have a bill in because I was very concerned about our preparedness pre-disaster. We don't have shelters in every town. We don't have shelters in the capital city. We don't have evacuation plans. We're lucky we didn't lose somebody on that Monday night. We had people stranded at the grocery store parking lot, stranded on the interstate because we've closed it, but they're on it. So I think as we prepare, if you live on the coast, you're prepared for the next big storm. There's evacuation routes. There's robocalls that tell you what's going on and yeah, if we're going to see this with any kind of regularity, we need to be prepared and have a plan.
I lied. Well, it's just sort of a next steps question if we're winding down, but are all of your proposals going to be in the budget, or do you have proposals for our committees to change regulatory frameworks to make it easier to do what you think needs to be done?
So some of the recovery related proposals, particularly those related to housing, I worked with them on those, but they're not in a resiliency package. They're being more presented as housing proposals.
Okay.
H627 is a couple of core concepts that will support resiliency and recovery.
I'm terrible with numbers. I thought there should be no.
Something was just introduced by Rep. Sims.
Okay.
And it focuses on the Flood Resilient Communities Fund.
Yes.
Expanding the uses of that, actually calling it the Resilient Communities Fund, because we went back and forth on disaster resilient, climate resilient, flood resilient. And it's like, we just want resilient communities.
Right.
So,
you want to schedule her in here or economic?
We'll talk.
Okay.
Okay.
and so that's really the linchpin. I do think that fund I think the first appropriation was ARPA. in that fund.
I'm looking at that, just trying to find money to raise houses down on Lower State that wanted to raise, and
Right.
we were looking for leftover ARPA money, and that was one of the funds that like I pointed to.
And within that bill, there's also a whole of government evaluation that I think would be kind of complementary to this AAR that Doug's mentioning, to kind of look at the entire framework, state and federal, and how we could all work a little better together with maybe additional governmental structures.
And Senator,
Bill.
in answering some of your questions, I hope I didn't seem to be trying to give the impression that we gave the municipalities all the support that they needed. That, I wasn't.
Yes, right.
I wasn't trying to go there.
Yeah,
I was trying to explain what we were providing and where we were providing it.
right.
But you're right, it's only a slice of the puzzle. It's difficult. Even when we try to be accessible, it's still difficult to access for people. So that's part of the purpose for the whole of government study, is that we know we're not making the human connections that we need to respond well. And there was a very high level of inequity about some communities responded very well and were tight knit and
Right.
information flowed well and decisions were made. Others communities, people really suffered because of communication.
Yeah,
barriers.
and I didn't mean to say that I thought you weren't doing everything you can, because you're like 6 people, not even full time.
In a big state, with lots of mountains. But lost my train of thought. I think having leadership at the local level, I went through a flood in Montpelier that people had in the textbook. And we used to complain every year about the money to send somebody to emergency management school, but it was the best money we ever spent when we had a disaster. And we've got small towns. I think when Johnson, we asked, we were there, who's your emergency man? Well, it's usually a member of the select board, and they're usually only there for 2 years. So that's supposed to be the person that's in charge. And it should be a little longer than a 2-year select board stint. And I think we need to find a way, they probably should be paid when they're acting in that capacity in a disaster.
Yeah.
But they should be the contact with the state. I mean, I'm sure Marshfield didn't have any potable water for 10 days.
When growing up in Marshfield, I heard a lot about that.
And it's 15 miles from the Gold Dome, and we didn't know that they didn't have water. And so, setting up that communications and chain of command is, we're gonna do this anymore, we're gonna have to have it done right.
And there's a lot there, right? And I think, because there are good things about if you have someone professional, their overtime can be paid for by FEMA, but their straight time won't be able to. Like, there's a lot to dig in there on what the impacts would be.
We've got to professionalize, not just, state says we have to have an emergency management guy. We've got to make it professional and make sure that, they do know what to do and who to call.
Just a curiosity question, different times I hear a lot about 211. Did that turn out to be a network that was functional and helpful in this case? I didn't hear anything about 211 in this instance. I just realized it now. And some other times we seem to count on it to get information out.
Yes, in this instance, I've seen the information flow. I haven't gotten reports of 211 not working for the December event. This instance. I do think there's a hard question there. Surge capacity for our VEM staff, for 211, for all kinds of different things. We can't afford to keep staff on hand that lets us manage this level of disaster all the time, right? But we need to be able to surge and adjust. And I know we're looking at that with 211 is how to, but I think since we just had the hiccups with 211, I think it was still fresh. They still had more resources around, so the December event collected data. There weren't that many calls. I think less than 60.
Yeah,
I think it's about our average for smaller events.
Yeah. curious what kind of roles it's filling. Yeah, it's a little like fire departments, you know. You can't afford to have a full-time fire department, so you have volunteers. Because you have people that show up for a search for a fire.
That's where I think regional discussions, resource sharing discussions, those are all gonna be extremely important because a town of 500, or Marshfield, when I grew up, had less than 800 in it. A professional EM for that town doesn't necessarily make sense, but for a region, could perhaps make sense.
Okay. Have you finished, we started asking questions, and I have a feeling you're not finished your presentation.
No, Madam Chair, I really wanted to come in here, kind of give an overview, give the committee an opportunity to ask me questions. And I know I'll be spending a lot of time in the building. I want to make sure that one of my main purposes is to be a central point of contact so that you can get the information you need to make good decisions. So I think that I just wanted to kick it off and kind of address some of the initial questions, but I assume, we'll have a lot more opportunities to talk as the session goes along.
A lot has happened since we left this building last year, but we're not gonna fix it in one session. I mean, everything that needs to happen is gonna take time, which is what's frustrating people and towns, but yeah, we don't have 1,000 workers to blanket the state with to help every town.
And as a side gig, I'm still watching the $600 to $700 million of ARPA that's moving around too.
So no one's really.
I'm looking for it to raise houses.
Is there a certain set of listservs or a box you can check to put some of us on all the email lists that people are getting? So we see the volume and the nature. I mean, I am a glutton for
You want more
punishment.
emails?
I do, because I want to just even understand the feeling of what they're going through, that would help us. That would just help us know what's happening out there.
I'll talk to Katie Buckley.
Okay.
I've worked a lot with her over the last several years, and Katie's amazing, and she's also, has a really good understanding of what a lot of the towns are going through.
Yeah.
So I'll talk to her to see what we can have there, because I know she's been trying to provide towns like a simplified place to get some advice and some support. And we've actually used their websites. We just refer people to their websites because they were designed very well and their templates are very clean. So why reinvent the wheel, right?
She with BLCT right now?
Yes.
Okay, everyone moves around enough. It's like.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're talking about, we're moving around.
Okay, committee, any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
On this committee, we'll see you in half an hour, but I'm
Good to be back in
sure, so we'll see you in half an hour.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, we're finished with the official stuff today, so we can go off. I'm looking for my copy of the